Angela, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Do you want to start by telling us a little bit about your start in business and where it all began?
Yeah, so I'm an interior architect by trade. I studied at RMIT in Melbourne in the 90s. And the reason I got into interiors was because I've always had that passion for my physical environment. Like I grew up playing outdoors, was never too cold to go outside, according to my mother. And when I was in high school and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, and they start to ask you, what are you going to do when you grow up? And I wasn't quite sure, but I did have a feeling I'd end up working in an office somewhere and in a profession. And I'd seen what offices looked like in the 80s, and they were pretty depressing spaces, which eventually led me to wanting to having some control over the environments that not only I inhabited, but that others inhabited. That's why I ended up studying what I did, and which then led to workspace design, because we spend so much time at work. And to me, I felt that was a real area that I could make a difference in terms of creating spaces that were better for people and places that people wanted to be. And so that eventually led to this business that I have now, which is called Futurespace, which predominantly creates spaces connected to the way we work. So that's workspace, education, commercial building, refurbishment, and other sort of things that connect to that.
And you obviously love that part around the space. Were you always business oriented and entrepreneurial in that way, or was that something that just evolved?
It's funny, when I was a kid, I've worked since I was 15. I've got a part-time job in a supermarket. But even before that, now that you ask that, I'm reminded that I used to make, this is very daggy, I used to make jewelry, at fibre jewelry. It was like leaves and gum nuts and things.
Oh, yeah.
And sell that in the local newsagent. And then I think when I was in high school, I was sewing moccasins on the train on the way to school and making money doing that. And my mum's always worked as well. Like she was a single mum, had 4 kids. And so, yeah, I guess there always has been that sort of desire to want to support myself and earn a living like that.
Yeah. What in terms of your strengths and weaknesses, tell us a little bit about your strengths and what makes you good at what you do.
I think what makes me good as a designer, I think, is the empathy I have for space and being able to look at a floor plan as I'm drawing and imagine what it would be like to be there. But in terms of being a business person, I think one of my strengths is that about 10 years ago, we had this strategy session with the business, and that personality testing that they do. And the guy who was running it said, there's one really unusual one. And I thought, that's got to be my colleague. And it ended up being me. And he said, what was unusual about it was that I really care about people, but at the same time, I can do the hard things and make the hard decisions. So I feel like that's a real strength, is that I can, the team is very important to me and the culture is very important to me and the people that I work with. But at the same time, if I have to do the hard stuff, and sometimes it's really hard being a leader and a CEO, I can still do that and do it with integrity. So I think that's one of my strengths.
What does that look like when you say do that with integrity?
To do things for the right reasons, so I had to restructure recently, and that was really tough because we're a really close team. It's tough for the team and it's been tough for me as well. I know it's the right decision. So I don't want to go into too much detail on that because it's people's sort of feelings and futures are involved. But yeah, it's just been hard in terms of making sure everyone's okay. But then at the same time, there are business decisions that need to be made for the good of the greater sort of success and future of the business, as well as what I can see happening in the future.
Yeah. And I imagine things when it comes to integrity and those sorts of things around communication, having those discussions and being upfront and explaining things, I guess, is how that's got to be done, right?
Yeah. And more than once.
Yeah.
It's a bit like that change management piece where it's communicate often, communicate early. And so it's that ongoing communication, being available, consistent messaging, giving people the information they need to be able to feel comfortable with change.
Yeah. What about in terms of weaknesses? What were some of the things that you look at and go, you weren't so good at that, and maybe you're still not good at it? And how do you overcome that though? Or what have you gotten better at?
Yeah, look,
You
I
sound
think
right.
my biggest learning has really been around the financial side of the
Yeah.
business. So not something I was ever taught at school, university, or at home. When I grew up, it was considered poor form to talk about money. And so I made a lot of mistakes. I had a girlfriend who's a CFO about 10 or 12 years ago teach me a lot about reading a P&L, balance sheets, all of that sort of thing. And then I did a course in Xero with a bunch of other bookkeepers and accountants, and they were all a bit like, the business owners in the room, don't tell her this and don't tell her that. But that's been it's been an ongoing process, really. And so lately, about 18 months ago, I became the sole owner of the business. So I've spent the last 18 months, and particularly the last 6 months, really getting into the nitty-gritty of making sure that spending is aligned with income, which is aligned with forecast billings, which is aligned with billable hours, and just getting all those things right and really right-sizing the business
Yeah.
so that we can then, from a financial perspective, so that we can then build for a future. So the financial stuff is, because I've got to switch sides of my brain too to get into the financial
Yeah.
things of the business. So that's why it feels like a physical switch.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really interesting because it is easy, especially when people are creative and looking at that side of things. It's often easier for people to, not easier, but they often will ignore that other side or the financial side and let somebody else do it or not be across it. Even if someone else is doing that side of things, it's easy to let go of it completely in some respects because it might not be as interesting or as where your heart lies. So, but that's to the detriment eventually because it's at the end of the day, you've got to be across the numbers. So it is difficult. It's a discipline thing, I think, in some respect, and an education thing.
Yeah. And I need that clarity. Like I wake up at 3 a.m. with that sort of that
Yeah.
gut if I'm not clear on my numbers.
Yeah. Okay.
It's really important.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. What about as you built the business? What were the best decisions you've made along the way that sort of really made a difference? Maybe a sliding doors moment or something like that, but something that really you look back on and think that was really important that I did that.
Yeah, I think actually one particular, sometimes when I do things that I really don't feel like doing, but I have no choice but to do, they've been the sliding doors moments. There was this one project also around about 10 years ago, and there was a lot going on in my life and a lot going on in the business. And there was a big pitch coming up, and our design director was away. And they're like, Angela, you've got to do this. And I'm like, oh God, it's the last thing I want to do.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I just thought, look, I've got nothing to lose. And so went all out, had fun with it, pulled the team together. We actually had a really great time building this pitch. It was a big job. We weren't attached to the results at all. We were just really attached.
Yeah.
And we blew them out of the water and won this amazing job that then turned into a bigger job and then another job. There were a Chinese client seeing this project. And so I think they're the sorts of things where you just think, oh, I don't want to. But then that sort of letting go and really just being genuine and authentic. And then the results just tend to come. It's handing it over to the universe in some ways.
Yeah. It's interesting that sort of serendipitous pathway in terms of you often look back and think of different clients that you work with or people that you know. And if you follow that trail back as to how you met them in the first place or how that came to be, it's often some very innocuous little interaction or something like that where you would otherwise never have met that person 3 or 4 connections down. But I always find that really intriguing and really interesting to reflect on.
I think it happens a lot in business.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like even the jobs that we've worked for SBS for a long time and almost 18 years. And we've done lots of, smaller projects for them because they're semi-government or they're government funded actually. And so they don't have a lot of budget. And we've just built this really, really beautiful, respectful relationship with them. And they have some interesting projects coming up and they've come to us for advice. And there's some really exciting opportunities ahead because we've done the hard yards and built that really trustful relationship.
Are there any sort of organizations or people that you've worked with along the way where you're really surprised by what it was like working with them, or you had a preconceived idea? You might not be able to give names, I don't know, but any of those sorts of things where you sort of get a thought and around how it might work, and then it's been different to expectations, exceeded expectations?
Yeah, there's the whole sector that I've been really surprised by, and that's the legal sector. I thought that they would be difficult to work with, but they're actually fantastic. And I think it's because they know that if you mess it up, they can sue you really easily.
Yeah.
But yeah, they've just been great to work with. I think what I like about working with that legal sector is that they have a real respect for us as a profession. They know what they're doing as a profession. We know what we're doing as a profession. And I think there's that mutual respect there. And they're just, I don't know, just surprisingly easy to work with because they're focused on their day job and they let us focus on our day job. I most recently worked with Gaydens, and they're a really interesting creative firm. So there's that side of it as well that makes it interesting for us.
Yeah. If we go back to when you started your business, what was your thought process around that from being in the industry and then saying, I want to do my own thing? Take us through that initial thought process and phase. How challenging was that?
I think I went into it not really thinking that much. So that was probably a good thing. If I had have thought about it too much, I probably wouldn't have done it. But I was working for an architectural practice and there were 4 architecture teams, 1 interiors team, and each team was its own P&L. And so I was running interiors and there was this opportunity where I could either bring one of my clients into that business and service that client in a way that was being dictated by the owner of that business, or I could leave and set up my own thing with this potential client and look after them the way that I wanted to. And so that was a real kind of fork in the road moment. And I just thought, look, the worst thing that can happen is I'll have to go and get a job because I know I'll be fine. And that was it really. And the job too was a museum for Qantas out at the domestic terminal. So it had been 20 years in the making. And by the time they got the approval of all the stakeholders and the funding and everything, so that was the project that I set up my business with, just thinking I'll give this a shot and see what happens. And that was 2004.
And then as you go along, in terms of taking on more, what was in terms of as a manager of people, what was the biggest learning curve in that area?
Yeah.
Or did that come naturally to you?
Oh, look, I'm naturally, I think, a people person, but I think probably the biggest learning is around alignment of motivations. I think as a business owner, sometimes it's like being a parent. And I was talking to a friend about this the other day. It's like when you're a parent or when you're a kid, right? Your parents tell you they love you and you think, yeah, whatever. And it's not until you have your own kids that you then start to go, oh, okay, I get it now, how much parents love me. And I think the difference between staff and business owner is similar. I don't think you understand what's involved in running a business until you actually do it yourself.
Yep.
And so for me, I think the challenge around people is appreciating that in the team, in that they can't possibly know the sorts of challenges that I'm going through or that the business is facing or all the sort of machinations behind the scene. It doesn't matter how much information you give them. It's just a really different perspective. So just appreciating their perspective on that, I guess, has been one of the biggest learnings for me.
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective. And it's completely true, right? No matter how much they can empathize with what you're going through, they're not the ones that are carrying the weight or worrying about those things at night or waking up in the night, like you said, like around all those, it's just a different type of
Just a different
position. Yeah, absolutely. How would you describe the culture in your business? And how have you tried to build that?
Yeah, we've worked pretty hard on the culture in terms of, like even before COVID, we gave people a lot of flexibility. And the culture has always been about, like, learning is one of our number one values, or is our number one value. And so we've always encouraged people to go. There's a lot of talks, there's a lot of events, there's a lot of conferences, there's a lot of publications. I've always written for design magazines. I've been doing that for about 20 years. So really just encouraging people to keep that sort of constant learning going. I'm 2/3 of the way through a PhD myself. One of the guys here is thinking of doing his master's. And then, so it's flexibility, learning. And then the other thing about culture is just valuing people. So for probably about 7 years, we have a daily huddle. We've been doing that. So we do a bigger session on a Monday morning. We do quick check-ins, 15 minutes every other day. And then on a Thursday, we do an appreciation exercise where we go around the room and everyone appreciates somebody else for something they've done during the week that's above and beyond. And it's just a really special part of the culture in that people get to acknowledge each other publicly. And I've had lots of feedback that it really helps new people come into the business as well and get to know everyone. But yeah, I've just had a lot of feedback that it's a really positive aspect of our culture and that sort of team connection and team building, and people are really close.
It's a really important and underrated aspect, I think, of a team culture of any team, because often you will hear the reasons people leave or aren't happy is just because they don't feel appreciated.
Yeah.
So something along those lines just makes complete sense. And like I said, it doesn't have to be a huge thing. People just like to be acknowledged for the little things they do that, like you say, go above and beyond.
Yeah. And
It really matters.
yeah, and it felt a bit daggy at first when I proposed it, and there was a bit of roughness from some of the guys. But yeah, it's actually been a really beautiful part of the business.
What do you love most about what you do?
There's so many things. I really love getting to know other businesses and the leadership. And because I do a lot of workplace strategy as well, and it's like dating another business. You really get to know them and their team and their culture.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
So I really love getting into that, into understanding how a business works and what they do and what their culture's like and where some of the gaps might be, and then creating a workspace that's really aligned with that. So if your culture is very collaborative, you're not going to put people in offices. You will have a lot of those spaces for people to be able to be collaborative. One of the funnest jobs actually I ever did was we did Google's first headquarters for them in
Okay.
late 2000s over at Workplace 6. So it was their first 6-star sustainable workplace around the world. And
wow.
they're a pretty tough client because we're Google. But at the same time, it was really fun. We got to do a lot of really fun things. And one of my favorite things was when you walked into reception, we had this desk that was in the shape of a boomerang. And behind the desk, there was a massive green wall, plant wall. And then the Google logo was in a rusted metal. So the minute you walked in, you could smell the plants and the flowers, and you could see that this was a different Google from any other Google in the world. It was the first in the world to do that. And then I saw there was that movie, I think, called not The Intern, or Interns or something. They were at Google's headquarters in California. And there was a big
Vince Vaughn and yeah.
Yeah, that's it. It was pretty funny. But yeah, so they had a big green wall and they're in the actual Google headquarters in the US. And I reckon they got that from Australia. So that was a pretty cool moment.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Working with an organization like that, we see a global tech giant, how different, or are they different in terms of their outlook or their mandate or how they see space and things like that compared to more traditional businesses? Did you notice a difference in their approach in that way?
Yeah, I think they were trying to maintain at the time that real startup feel because I think they'd grown so quickly. But in terms of their approach to space, for them it was, and I remember clearly the global head of real estate was calling it less me space and more we space. So the focus was really on, like the individual desks were quite small at the time, and the focus was really on all of those spaces where people came together. So we had a big commercial kitchen, we had micro kitchens on every floor. The food piece was really important for them. We had tents, we had swings, we had fish tanks. They wanted a slide, but because of the building, we couldn't do that. But yeah, they're really focused on it being about Google and the team and all of those collaborative alternative spaces to the desk.
Almost pushing people into the group spaces rather than letting them be in the individual parts.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. Tell me about your PhD. I read that and I was going to ask you about, so bring that up. What inspired you to do that? And are you enjoying it? And are you looking forward to finishing the final third?
Yes, yes, and yes. That is one of the things that wakes me up in the middle of the night as well. So I got invited to do it. So it's myself and 2 others. And we're the first, so it's at the School of RMIT Architecture and Design in Melbourne. And that was where I got my first degree. So the 3 of us, we're the first to go through this process because it's a reflective industry practice, PhD. So what you do is you look over your last 20 plus years of practice and look at what is unique about what you do and what you contribute to the profession. Okay. So I've had to have some leave over the last couple of years because I just had a few other things going on, but I'm back this month. and I've got to get my dissertation finished by January and then examination mid next year. But mine's about how I use writing as a design technique. So rather than drawing or other ways that people design, I use writing. And so it's just looking at that as a technique and what the contribution is that makes to the profession. And it's been amazing, actually, because I didn't realize that until I reflected on my practice.
Okay.
That was the way I operate. And it just gave me this new confidence as a designer that what I was doing was really worthy as a contribution, because I was measuring myself against the other different, more, not classic, but more what most people would understand to be a designer does.
Traditional idea of what it might be in the industry.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's been really, really amazing.
When you say writing, you're talking about the notes you write, the articles you write, that type of thing. Tell me what you mean by writing.
Yeah, so like I write the concept, for example. If we've got a project and we will have an overarching idea, and then I will write what that concept is. So one of the ones I did for IAG
Oh, okay.
it was Project Dawn. They were calling it Project Dawn internally. And that sort of became the inspiration for the overall conceptual theme for us. And so it was about this idea of dawn and first light and emerging kind of ideas. And so I wrote the design vision based on that. And then from that, what does that mean in terms of the built elements? So in terms of the built details, light, colour, the biophilia and those sorts of things. So if your overarching concept is about first light, so we then had a lightness to everything. So a lightness to the furniture, a lightness to the palette, a lightness to the deep, this layering of materials. And so writing that early on before we start to pull other concepts together. So that's as much for the client as it is for the design team to have something to build from and then create this environment that's really on brand for a business.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's when you're not in the industry, that's fascinating to see sort of how those things become the articulated vision, if you like, that become the foundation from which to branch out and expand and go deeper on as well.
Yeah, because there's a lot of thought that goes, it's not just, I like that colour, or this is the latest piece of furniture. There's a huge amount of thinking behind and strategy behind what we do.
It's not dissimilar to, and it's obviously quite different, but it makes me think of someone else we've got coming on the podcast in a couple of months where they're around marketing strategy and design of logos of a lot of well-known companies. And it's not, you just look at the logo, but when you actually drill down into the finished product of whatever is designed, which is similar to the workspace, same thing, there's a whole heap of thought process and imagery and stories that go into that finished product that you, unless you've probably gone through that process, you might not appreciate just how deep that thought process is.
Yeah, exactly. And it reminds me, I saw this great quote at the Design Museum in London like a few years ago, and it was, creativity loves constraints. So by writing the brief, it starts to pull these constraints together. That means the design can evolve within this framework.
Yeah, that's really interesting because that's counterintuitive to what I would think creativity would like, which makes complete sense when you say it like that. But from someone who's not particularly creative, when you think of creativity, you think of being unrestrained and being able to be free. But to put constraints around it, actually, I can imagine would be critical. When you say it like that, it's actually quite profound.
Yeah, and it forces you to be more creative because, and typically for us, the constraints are time and budget. And then like often the jobs with the tightest budgets are the ones we get to be most creative in.
What inspires you in business or life? What sort of things?
Yeah, I think lots of different, being out in nature really inspires me. It just gets my head clear from the city. And I'm a swimmer as well. So I do winter swimming and summer and winter, but I started off doing winter swimming at Bondi at icebergs. You know, doing laps in the cold water is amazing for inspiration. But I think one of the biggest things is it's more in life, and it's the women in my life. I know school mums, girlfriends, just social friends. I know so many different women who are all amazing and they just crack on with stuff. And I don't know, I've had some challenges over the last couple of years, and the way that the women in my life have just shown up out of nowhere has just been incredible. So I think I get a lot from that. Yeah, just the awesome women I know.
Yeah, that's nice. What about challenges in terms of from a business perspective? And you've talked about the challenges more recently, but what about earlier on in the business? What were some of the bigger either mistakes or challenges that you had to encounter?
I feel like there were actually too many, to be honest. I feel like now's the most challenging time I've ever faced. It's a hyper competitive market. There's more players than ever. The challenges I think I've already spoken about is like the learnings around the financial. When I started my business, I was a subtenant of another business. It was a bit like co-working before co-working was invented. So that allowed me to set up in a pretty lean way and then grow. And then I merged my business with Futurespace in 2009. Yeah, challenge-wise, I don't think it's anything other than what I've already talked about.
Was COVID difficult? How did that impact the day-to-day work, or was in terms of the work coming in, did that change overnight, or was that just business as usual?
Yeah, no, look, there were three really distinct types of, I guess, things that happened for us in terms of projects. Any project that was under construction got finished really quickly because the builders had fantastic access to sites. As you saw on the road were all the youths.
Yeah.
Anything that was in those early phases of emerging just completely stopped. And then there were a few new projects, and one of them was we won a big job for IAG right at the beginning of COVID, and that was to engage with 8,000 of their staff around Australia and then redo their workplace guidelines and then implement their workplace guidelines. So we implemented in Perth, and that was one of the first post-COVID workplaces in Australia. I think we were lucky in that sense that we'd won that big job in the beginning. But it did change the business. We went to a 4-day week for quite a while. We didn't have to restructure, but we got some of the government benefits that were available. It's funny, our design director at the time, in March of 2020, I said, I hope this goes on for a little while because then people will really appreciate the value of the workplace. And I meant a few months, not 5 years.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think in some ways it was good because it elevated that conversation around workplace. But then in other ways, suddenly everyone was an expert. So it made it more competitive for us. So yeah, it was and I think in a lot of ways, we're just now feeling the after effects of COVID because there seems to be this inertia in decision-making in a lot of businesses. They don't know what to do, so they don't do anything. But really, your workplace hasn't evolved in the last 5 years. Something has to be done because the way we work is so fundamentally different now.
How difficult do you find having that paradigm in terms of what you do, bringing that into, or is it really easy maybe, in terms of your own business, your own home and everything that you do? Do you feel a pressure to have things a certain way, or do you just enjoy making your spaces how you want them because you know what you're doing?
A pressure to have our office a certain way or have our culture a certain
Yeah, no, just in terms of dealing with the space, that's what you do. You want that to, presumably everywhere you go, people are looking, this is what you do. So is there some sort of pressure in that? Probably not by the sounds of it.
No, I don't think it's not a pressure, but it's more of I have to have a nice space. Not because I care what other people think, but because it's important to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the office is a really beautiful space to be. Like my home is such a safe place. It's a really beautiful place to be. I waited 4 months for a new sofa from Denmark that just arrived a month ago, and I'm still over all that stuff.
Yeah, okay. So you're really passionate about that, and that just overrides anything else because you know exactly what you want. It doesn't matter what anybody else, this is what you want and you love what you do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that make it difficult to go into other places? And sometimes you must just look at things, how they're designed and be like, gee, they could have done this a little bit differently.
I am constantly redesigning places in my mind, yes.
Yeah, I wondered. What about advice you would give people? People going into business, what would you tell them? Or what's the best advice you've been given?
I think just give it a go. What else can you do? I think it's got to be for the right reasons. It's got to be authentic. And I think the vision really needs to be about what's important to you and your values and your value systems and how do you want to make a contribution. For me, I find that the times I'm most successful is when it's not about me and what I want to achieve, it's about what I can contribute. Because really, I'm in a service industry. I'm creating spaces for clients who are challenged by all sorts of things, including the cost of fit outs cost a lot, right? So we want to make sure that people are getting bang for their buck in all sorts of ways. Yeah, I think for me, it would, like if I was to give someone advice, I would say be authentic, give it a go, and do what's important to you.
Yeah. Wise words. What about business people? Who are there? Are there business people that you look at and really like the way they go about business?
There's some of my competitors I really admire because there's one in particular, and she's created this really successful business, and she's just really gone for it she's just had real guts about what she's done, I think.
Yeah.
And she's just
Unapologetically bold.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And she's from another culture that is the way their culture is as well. And I think that's part of it. And I do really admire that I'm just going to go ahead and take over the world, but in a nice way. Yeah. And she's done a really amazing job, and I do really admire her for that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think I've ever had anybody give credit to their competitor before. I respect that. What about business books? Any business books? Do you read business books or biographies or any of those types of things?
I'm reading something at the moment about a New Zealand woman who worked at Facebook. I can't remember what it's called. It's something like, I'll have to get back to you on that. But
is this the whistleblower one?
It's orange on the cover. It's something like Careless People.
Yeah. It's been the press a fair bit lately. I think she's on 60 Minutes as well. Really interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm reading that. But I have ADHD, so I have so many books. I'm only like a third of the way through. So I listen to podcasts, and one of my favorites is Malcolm Gladwell, that revisionist theory. And it's not really business, but I just love his approach on things in terms of an accepted version of something doesn't always have to be the truth. There's always another perspective. So I found that whole series so interesting, and just being able to kind of open your mind a bit to other ways of doing things I found really useful.
Yeah, he's an interesting thinker. I've read quite a few of his books, and I haven't listened to his podcast, but I've read quite a few of his books, and I really enjoy the way he looks at the world and just gives you different ways of thinking about things. I think it's quite good. On the books front, I'm with you. I think it's the book's responsibility to make me read the whole thing. If I only get a third of the way through it, it's not my fault. I think it's the book's fault. It should have been more engaging. So I don't think you should blame yourself for that.
Oh, that's good.
What about any quotes on business, leadership, or life that you live by?
I don't know if you want to use this or not, but I find lots of inspirational stuff on Instagram, and I save that. And a lot of them are really just about trusting the process, really. And like sometimes you can be in the midst of a whole lot of stuff going on, and just knowing that the little steps I'm doing today, actually working towards something, I find a lot of inspiration in those sorts of things. I don't have any quotes.
No, it's funny though, but I do the same thing where you save those things because they're good little reminders for later. You read and think, like you knew that quote probably from before, but when you see it, sometimes it's just worth saving it and put it in a folder. Not saying I do that. No, I do that. I save and put it in a folder, and I probably never go back to them, but I've got a whole bunch of those things where they've been interesting things, and I just want to be able to know that if it's there, that if I want to read through something on that particular sort of theme or topic, they're there. And it is actually quite a good process to go through, I think.
Yeah, actually, I was looking at that this morning thinking, I'm saving all these things. Am I ever going to go back to them? I think I probably should.
No, you probably won't.
Actually, I do have one. I do have that Marianne Williamson. It's not out where she starts off, and it often gets attributed to Nelson Mandela saying it when he got out of prison, but it's Marianne Williamson, and it's not our darkness that frightens us, it's our light. Do you know that one? It's quite long. I'll send it to you. I've got that.
Send it. Yeah. That's interesting.
Yeah. It's about
send that through. We'll put in the notes.
Yeah. I find that's a really good one. It's just about following our own truth.
In the years ahead, what's next? What's next in the sort of next 5-10 years?
Yeah, I'm actually just working on the vision for that at the moment. Given I started my business in 2004, and the landscape has changed so dramatically since then. I think as a smaller business, it's now harder. There's a lot of the big clients that we have got things in place that sort of exclude us in a lot of ways, like having certain accreditations and sometimes modern slavery acts and whatever. Like, I don't have a lot of that. Like some of the global clients and decisions made out of procurement in Asia, for example. they're just looking at stuff on paper, not the relationship. But what's next? So the vision for what's next is really, I think, going back to first principles of why I started this thing in the first place and what was it I wanted to deliver and achieve, and what are some other ways that I can actually do that, and just having a bit of I've got a couple of people I'm setting up a visioning session with to, just prepare that vision for the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, excellent. Angela, thank you very much for joining us on the show. It's been really great to learn about your journey.
Thanks, Dale. It's been nice to meet you and great to chat.
Thanks.